purpose of this video is to explore the basic structure of the Codex form, beginning with a very brief history of the book and then leading into a tutorial on sewing pamphlet stitch books. The history of books is very much the history of humanity. The form of the book we are familiar with, the Codex, is a relatively new invention, spanning just a couple of millennia. Books began with no form at all in the oral tradition, in prehistory. With the advent of the written language, we required vessels or platforms to carry the scripts. Cave paintings and stone carvings began very early, but the first transportable books came in the form of Mesopotamian clay tablets from the first agrarian civilizations that formed in the river valleys along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. In ancient Egypt, they used papyrus reeds that grew in the Nile Delta to make scrolls, which came to be the predominant form of book during the Classical Age in Greece and Rome, up until around 500 Common Era. The first folded book, known as a codex, came up during the Classical Age, but did not garner much popularity. The ancients often wrote on wax tablets, similar in many ways to our own slate tablets from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Sometimes the tablets would be twined together, forming a rudimentary codex. The popularity of the Codex can be loosely tied to the rise of Christianity. The books of the Christian Bible are most commonly associated with this form, just as Jewish sacred script, the Talmud, is associated with the scroll. The early Christian sects in Egypt, known as the Coptics, first used the Codex, in this case using an exposed spine technique known eponymously as the Coptic binding. In this, a chain-link stitch is used throughout to bind the multiple sections together and holds the book block to the wooden covers. Throughout the early medieval period in Europe and the Near East, the Codex became much more sophisticated, acquiring leather covers for the boards and spine, metal bosses and corners to further protect the book, and sometimes decorated with precious metals and gemstones, an indication of how highly valued books were as objects. Around this time, and completely independently, the Codex appeared in China and Japan, as can be seen with this distinctive Japanese stab binding. In pre-Columbian America, the Aztec and Mayan cultures developed a kind of codex made in an accordion style that folded up between hard covers. It could be thought of as a middle stage between scroll and codex. These are pages from the Dresden Codex, which extends for 78 pages. They're 4 inches by 8 inches in size and 12 feet long when fully opened. Examples of these books are exceedingly rare, since Spanish explorers and missionaries destroyed most of them. Back in the West, book sections are sewn on a sewing frame, where threads can be worked over vertical cords or tapes to give larger books greater strength, and as a way to attach the book boards to the book block or pages. Book presses and lying presses are used to form the shape of the book prior to attaching the covers. Here you can see an early book with an exposed spine, showing how the cords interact with the spine and the cover. The naming of the parts of the book follow a humanist line. Externally, they had a head, a front and back, a foot, a shoulder, and a spine. Internally, binders found new words to describe the flyleaf, foredge, and hinges. Throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, books tended to be bought unbound. Then the book owner could choose to leave it unbound, or have it bound to suit their needs or means. All throughout this time, unbound pamphlets were popular, being an inexpensive manner to spread information and ideas. They were sold in a similar manner to newspapers on street corners in the 20th century. Pamphlets were never intended to be bound, although some were clad as slim volumes, and later libraries bound gatherings of pamphlets into single editions. Little changed in bookbinding until the 18th century, and even after new industrial equipment made binding less labor-intensive, the decoration of books was still done by hand. Gold tooling and embellishment became more prevalent, associated with class and wealth. Come the 20th century, the heightened state of literacy amongst the masses allowed for small and private publishers to issue small runs of single-section bound books in paper or cloth wraps. To this day, writers still self-publish poems and short stories in this compact format. Books are in the midst of another great change, and yet, How different are they? Throughout history, we have moved through different forms of books, each perhaps more efficient or practical than the last. How we envision our books of the future may involve how they physically worked for us in the past. So what you'll require for this exercise is some paper, 8.5 by 11, it's fine. But I managed to find these colored file folders, which will, they're already pre-folded, which will make perfectly good covers. The other thing you'll need is a needle. This is actually a bookbinding needle. You don't have to use one of those. This be one that has a fairly large eye, so you can get a good sized thread through it. But any needle will do. I've got this awl. This is essentially another needle that's been put into an adjustable awl that can tighten up for punching holes, but you don't need it per se, because you can use your needle to do that. It's just easier if you have something that you can actually get a good grip on. A pair of scissors is going to be handy. For the thread, what is conventionally used in bookbinding, it's called linen thread. Once again, I think any thread that you have access to is good. As long as it's not too thin. The thinner it is, the easier it is to rip the paper, because it's actually, thread is quite sharp and strong. If you can't find linen thread, there is always the option. Every student always asks, can I use dental floss? And professional bookbinders go into palpitations if they find out that you've used dental floss on on your book. But frankly, as far as I'm concerned, what we're doing here is not trying to do fine binding. We're just trying to have the experience of binding a book. So if that's all you have access to, by all means, use it. Let me take one of these. There we go. So what we have here, we're going to do a single signature book. We use 4 leaves. So we've got 2 done already. Take 2, put them together, fold them up, insert them into the 2 that I had already done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to insert it inside here, open it up to the middle. I'm going to add another hole in the center. Right, so there's one hole here, one here, adding a third one. And depending on where you start, decides where the knot ends up. So now here's where we do a little trick. We want both the in and out to go around the center line so that it's locked in place. If you want to pull it tight, make sure you pull in the direction that the thread is going. So this thread I'm tugging on now is coming out over here. So I'm pulling the same direction. Thing is, if I pull against the direction, then it's putting pressure on the small hole in the paper, which isn't very strong and can tear if you put too much stress on it. So there's a single signature book. Now we're going to bind a multi-section binding. Make a cover much as you did previously, using cardstock or a folder, whatever you have. Also prepare 4 sections composed of 4 folded sheets each, making for a 64-page book. Fold it in half so you've got your lines. And we know that this is the edge. So we're going to put 1, 2, 3, 4 as evenly as you can space it. Just have to make sure they're in the right spot. So yes, just going to make sure that all my holes line up, and they do fairly well. And make sure they correspond with the cover I've just done for it, and it does fairly well. Start at the bottom, very bottom. Then you go in. Again, and this time, as you put your needle through, all you do is you find the hole. That's the, the right one. And zinga. Tie it off. Standard knot. Double it up to make sure it doesn't undo itself. Don't trim off the excess on that like I did on mine. You'll need that at the end. Don't tug too hard on the threads, especially when working with holes placed so close together. Now before I put the last hole in here and tie it off, I'm just going to go back through the sections and make sure that everything I've got is nice and tight. It does seem to be. There's no big loops of anything in evidence, so that's good news. So go back to here, through. Because I cut the tail off at the very beginning there, it means I've got myself into a little bit of a trouble here. I've got to make a knot, an open knot, that I can slip over top of the stub end and then tie it off tightly, which, you know, I've done enough times that I know how to do it pretty well, but it's much easier if you can just tie it off with long ends.